Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Autonomous Vehicles and Future of Urban Design Part 2 event. Our Part 1 event was back in April, and you can find that online under the same name on YouTube, minus the Part 2. My name is John Larson Friend. I am up here in Seattle. I'm the Deputy Director of Membership for YPT Northwest, the Northwest Regional District. And then we have Eddie as well. I'll let him introduce himself.
Eddie Isaacs. I'm with YPT Los Angeles as its chairperson right now, him. And also I'm the YPT North America Southwestern Region membership director. We're trying to grow the board, but we're underway this summer as it continues. And thank you for being here this evening.
Absolutely. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. This is a part of the YPT International series about autonomous vehicles. YPT International is trying to do several different types of these themed events throughout the year. They've gotten into some rail events and upcoming space events, which is pretty exciting. Didn't think about transportation in space, did you? So keep an eye out for those events. If you aren't a member of YPT, it's only $20 a year, and it supports our efforts to connect young professionals in transportation. I promise you it's worth it. We recently had an event up here in Seattle that we paid for people to go to the Museum of Flight, and it was a $25, so you actually got money back. To do that, go to the YPT International website or find your local chapter's website to sign up there. We are going to ask that you keep your camera and mics off for most of the time. There might be some time toward the end for a Q&A, and at that point we'll invite people to unmute and turn their cameras on if they so choose. And I would say because we're kind of on the normal Zoom, not the other special type of webinar Zoom, maybe put your screen on spotlight for maybe the best experience, or start pinning people. Well, we'll get into that in a second. I do have a YPT Northwest update. I'm going to share my screen real quick. We have I think an upcoming LinkedIn post coming up. Just wanted to share that we have board members now for the Northwest region. Our regional director is Paige Miller. She is in Portland. We have Tanya Shah in Vancouver, BC, and she is the Deputy Director of Programs. And we have Diane Zhao here in Seattle with me, and she is the Deputy Director of Communication. So I just wanted to make sure you see their faces and know who to look for future events, and even some local events if you're in the area. So I am very happy to announce that, so last time for our part 1 event, we weren't able to have all 4 of our panelists due to family emergencies and COVID and all those fun spring events that we had a few months ago back in April. But today we have our original planned panel, which I'm very excited about. So first we have Marissa Walker, Senior Vice President, Infrastructure and Executive Director of the Institute of Automated Mobility at Arizona Commerce Authority. Dr. Hujan Tan, Research Assistant at Portland State University. Rima Griffith, Executive Director at Washington State Transportation Commission. And Dr. William Briggs, Professor at University of San Francisco, author of End of the Road, Reimagining the Street as the Heart of the City. So now I'm going to hand it off to them one by one so that they can introduce themselves to you and give you a bit of an idea of their expertise and what to look for during this conversation. So I will invite Marissa to chat first.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I appreciate it, John. So as mentioned, I'm Marissa Walker. I work for the Arizona Commerce Authority. We're the state of Arizona's economic development organization. And I wear 2 hats. One is Senior Vice President for Infrastructure, so bricks and mortar activities, largely around facilitating our trade relationship, so corridors and a lot of activity around the development of our border projects. And then in 2018, our governor established by executive order an Institute of Automated Mobility facility in the Arizona Commerce Authority, and I'm the executive director for that. Now I'll get into a discussion a little bit more about the Institute, but glad to be here, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Marissa. Dr. Tan, I'll invite you to introduce yourself next.
Hi, I'm Huijun Tan. I'm a PhD candidate in urban studies at Portland State University. I mainly focus on the equitable accessibility planning among marginalized communities and populations. Now I'm also helping SDOT with the citywide evaluation for the State Healthy Street program. So in Portland, I'm mainly involved in different transportation research projects in our school's Transportation Research and Education Center. Projects like how TOD development impacting our travel behavior and also neighborhood change, and how the city's like transportation incentive program affecting the affordable housing residents. So mostly what I do is like research projects, but also collaborating with the local transportation agencies. And I was like a research intern like a couple years ago in Urbanism Next at the University of Oregon, and mostly doing some literature review for the autonomous vehicles technology and how the technology might impact our city. And that's mostly the background that leads to this panel. Thank you.
That's super exciting. As a undergrad graduate of Portland State University and a grad of University of Oregon, I love all those institutions. So glad to have you here. Next we have Rima Griffith.
Hi, good evening. So I am the executive director of the Washington State Transportation Commission. Our commission is a 7-member board, members representing all over the state, appointed by the governor. They serve up to 6-year, 2 terms for 6 years. So total of 12 total at the end of that, if they make it that long. It's a lot of work. They serve as the tolling authority for the state, setting out the tolls and toll policies. So working closely with the Washington State Department of Transportation. They also set the ferry fares and fare policies for the Washington State ferry system. They do the long range statewide transportation plan, the 20-year outlook basically for how we're planning for transportation going forward. Working closely, of course, with the Department of Transportation and all of the MPOs or metropolitan planning organizations across our state. And then they also conduct a number of special studies and carry out efforts as directed by the legislature. Pertinent to this topic, in 2018, the legislature passed a bill that directed the commission to set up and appoint an AV work group. So the commission put that in place in 2018. It sunsets at the end of 2023. There's about 34 members on the executive committee, and we have 7 subcommittees on 7 various topics that feed into the discussion and research. And the overall direction from the legislature was to advise them based upon the input from this work group on how Washington State can prepare for the operation of autonomous vehicles on our public roadways. So that's the work we've been doing to date. Thanks. It's great to be here with you guys.
Glad to have you. And finally, we have Dr. Riggs. We'd love to hear from you, lastly, I guess.
Thanks, John. Billy Riggs. I don't go by William, even though a lot of people read my work as William. I am a professor at University of San Francisco. I lead a center called Autonomous Vehicles in the City. I also focus a lot on civil engineering design for new mobility on streets and roads. I guess the one thing that I spent the most time on the last few years is actually working on something that I couldn't talk about months ago. I couldn't have talked about when we originally planned this, but now I can talk about that. The last 6 months, we've been actually doing a first of kind rider test in partnership with Cruise. So doing actual travel behavior research in licensed autonomous vehicles that are out there on the road and carrying people around to destinations in San Francisco.
Well, it sounds like you getting COVID may have been good for us today. So, so I think now we'll move into the Q&A session. We have some preset questions that I think we'll just kind of popcorn around. We have a smaller group today, and I think that'll be a really great way to just kind of have a discussion, really. So the first question that we have here today is actually the first question from the last session. I kept it because I really liked it. It's that we have been talking about AV technology for decades now. Why should we still be talking about it now? And I'll let anyone talk at this point. The floor is open.
Well, I would just jump in and say that we're still talking about it because they're not here yet. I mean, it's kind of, there's a lot of testing happening and innovation and development going on, but we're far from being there or feeling like we're done talking about it, because there's still so much unknown about how they will advance, how they will fit into society, what role will they play in transportation in particular, and what does that mean for the changing structure of transportation and how we think about moving long term.
Yeah, I think like from my perspective, autonomous vehicle is a way to connect the present and the future. Like even if like complete self-driving cars are still years to go, but I think the recent years like discussion on smart city and other like new mobility, emerging new mobility definitely benefit and kind of interconnected with the conversation of autonomous vehicle deployment instead of just like a stereo-eyed vision. Some type of like, we should look at like some existing new mobility deployment, like the ride hailing and also the mobility as like a service, that type of topic. I think autonomous vehicle definitely can like benefit to those kind of conversation, because those type of like conversation and planning definitely providing the ecosystem future or planning for autonomous vehicle. So, and I think like autonomous vehicle, they classify like 5 levels, right? So I think like that type of companies will make incremental and steady progress to reaching different levels of autonomous vehicle, and which means like the rollout of autonomous vehicles might be also like an incremental process. So I think it's really important for cities planning policies to start to envisioning and planning and regulating how different level of like autonomous vehicles like appear in their like cities right now. So I think if the transportation planning or master plan need to like do like 20 years, that type of vision, definitely we need to like incorporate autonomous vehicle into our plans in the future. So I think that's why we still need to talk about autonomous vehicle.
Bill, I
I think
don't know
that-
if you, yeah, you want, yeah, go ahead.
It doesn't matter. I mean, I'll yield to you. I mean, I do think, you know, there are dueling opinions about whether or not there needs to be a phased kind of phased deployment of levels 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 AVs. So let me start out by saying, like, just for those of you that don't know the levels of automation, like level 5 is basically the idea that the vehicle can operate all conditions all the time robotically. And so I think John Krasnick from Waymo, even a couple of years ago in 2019, was saying this idea of level 5 is a myth, just like this idea that I can't drive in the mountains in blinding snow. A computer vision also fails when inclement weather and other factors actually limit it. So I mean, that's but I feel like there's a strong push amongst the real autonomous driving companies that we shouldn't have anything that vehicles below level 4 really should not be out there without safety drivers. And this is actually a direct counterpoint to, I think, really what Elon Musk has talked about and called Tesla Autopilot a level 3 vehicle. And we just need to dispel the myth now that, like, if you have advanced driver assist, which is what Tesla Autopilot is, that is what's called a level 2 vehicle. It's got some automated features, but it's really not. It's not something where we would license that vehicle at the mostly at the state level. So I think that when we think about just in terms of phased rollout, I think there is the reason why I should talk about it is because from a regulatory standpoint, there are a lot of people on the regulatory side as well as the industry side that don't believe in a phased rollout. They believe that we should have level 4 vehicles or vehicles that don't require a safety driver, and then everything else requires a driver in the vehicle. And furthermore, I think that that requires assertive policy, and it requires advanced planning. And I'll say a couple things that require advanced planning is like, what you need right now to be able to do that is really sophisticated digital maps of your roadways, particularly in urban conditions. And that's how companies like Waymo and Cruise and to a certain degree, Aurora, which is doing long haul trucking in Texas, have been able to deploy level 4 vehicles. They have really great maps that they can compare using machine vision, and they can actually they can compare those digital maps, those 3D maps of the roadways that they have done to the reality that the sensors on the vehicles are absorbing on the road. So sorry, a little long-winded, but I do think that there's a lot of room for local, state, and I would even suggest federal policy to kind of lay out the roadmap for how these vehicles deploy and where they deploy.
And I guess I would just round out, because I think everything that's been said, I totally concur with. I think the reason we still need to talk about it is almost not to be too reductive, but it's twofold. One is that we don't even have a consensus on how to evaluate the safety of these vehicles. One of the things that we're working on in the Institute is what data matters. What are the metrics? We've got colleagues in various locations that are looking at important elements of the question, like disengagements, which does tell you something. It just doesn't tell you everything. And we're still in a process, and I suspect we'll start talking about partnerships and that whole siloing of public and private engagement that's going to be so critical going forward. But we still have so many questions to ask. And I guess the other reason why we need to really continue this conversation is that for all of us who are involved in transportation, it takes forever. We're in a little bit of an exciting period with the passage of the IIJA, and I suspect everybody is really eager to see some of the particularly discretionary grants that are going to come out, with the Smart Transportation Grant that's anticipated in the third quarter, which holds hope for really doing some really thoughtful advancements in this space. But transportation can take decades between concept to design to construction. And I personally, and I do appreciate the messaging that we get from a lot of our partners in the whole ADS developer space, where if they had to wait for infrastructure to catch up, they'd never get out on the road. So part of this is that rub of ensuring that they're being safe, but yet they get to test their systems, operate in these domain spaces to kind of learn the whole machine learning that Bill was talking about, and utilizing computer vision and other technology. But we've got a long way to go as far as how those vehicles actually engage on the roadway. And many of the developers talk about, oh, just make sure there's no potholes, make sure the signage is well. And I do think that plays an important part of how their systems operate safely. But we have so many different edge cases, whether it's work zones or situations with school zones, or you have an accident on the road and the vehicle needs to be able to navigate around a situation where you have a first responder telling the vehicle to go up a wrong lane just to be able to avoid additional collisions. So there's just there's so much excitement about the technology, but there's just so many questions still to ask. And I think one of the big hurdles going forward is breaking down a lot of the silos across discipline. I'm so excited that there's a number of the panelists that have such expertise around equity, because we're hearing more and more about that. And I'll be candid, that's just it's just a cavern of questions in that space that I think needs more attention. So anyway, that's my long-winded response to why we need to still keep talking about it.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Actually, I'm gonna switch around my questions a little bit just so we can dig into that last point that you made, Marissa. Thinking about equity, what are some of the possible negative effects of AV technology? And if there are, which we know there might be, what can we do to start mitigating those outcomes to hopefully push more equity instead of creating more equity problems through AV technology.
Well, I'd say if from our perspective, some of the things we're thinking about in this vein is, ensuring equal access is important. So when you contemplate the different use cases for AVs and how they might work, and thinking maybe about shuttle services, for example, on the one hand, autonomous vehicles are going to present a huge opportunity for people who are, for example, sight impaired and cannot drive today, or have disabilities that limit their mobility. So the idea of being able to have a car either come pick you up, or maybe you own one, depending on how this all develops, that can take you and give you that independence of mobility is huge. So there's a great benefit. But the affordability aspect of it, if we look at the market trends around electric vehicles, one can only imagine that these are going to be expensive vehicles, and to then think of them in more of a car share environment or scenario. How do we make sure that they're affordable and they're in more than just our dense urban areas? So again, thinking about the rural or the suburban environments is important. Thinking about how we close those transit gaps for people that are riding transit today. So I think we're realizing that there's a lot of benefits, but there's going to have to be a lot of intentional consideration around how we think about the provision of AV services to ensure that it really is equally accessible, right, to everyone, regardless of income, race, or where you might geographically be located.
Yeah, I think the whole rollout decision, like for autonomous vehicle, needs to like incorporate the lens of equity rather than just like treating equity as like an afterthought, that type of issue. And I think like, for example, the older adults, we have like a 10.6 million older adults living in rural area in US. And we know in general, the older adult, that population, a quarter of them, they don't really go out to travel. So like that type of population, actually, they can benefit a lot from autonomous vehicle development, but they also have many like needs and barriers regarding to travel, like their physical or cognitive barriers, and whether they know how to use smartphone or some languages like problems, and who are the who take the responsibility to like or who's the roles to help those type of populations to access smartphone or learn how to use those technologies. I think that part is like equity that we're talking about, and elder adults just like one populations. We need to like think about it, the whole spectrum of like the populations that we're talking about equity, right? Some lower income populations and who are living it far away, the geography coverage that we talk about, the autonomous vehicle. So I think we need to like promote more like universal design for autonomous vehicle and other form of new mobility as well. So yeah, that's what I'm thinking about, for example, just for equity example.
Yeah, there's probably a whole lot more that needs to be done. I know we have a company in the greater Phoenix region, Waymo, who's been working with US DOT, describes as transportation challenge communities, whether it's visual or otherwise, trying to address increased access. I think Dr. Tan really hit on something that's equally important too, and it's that, even in Arizona, like we do around the United States, we've got transportation deserts. I mean, people that don't have access to vehicles that are not automatic, right? They're just access to regular transportation. So the question is, how does automated vehicles and them becoming more ubiquitous in our communities help to address some of the transportation challenges that those communities are persistently encountering, regardless of the amount of technology in the vehicle?
The issue, I mean, I think that I hear everybody, I think we'd all agree in service equity and accessibility is important. I guess I just want to say, you know, part of the challenge with our transportation systems right now too is that we can't put innovative technology in a double bind because we actually don't have best equitable service right now. So, you know, part of the tension I've been seeing is that the density required to operate a high capacity vehicle from a private sector standpoint actually may not be something, you know, I'm not sure how supportable financially and economically a rural autonomous vehicle service is. I'm just going to put that out there. I think it's a wicked problem. But when you think about, there's no cross subsidization between public and private right now. And so if we have these private services that we're relying on to provide a public benefit, do we require them to take on what is currently a government subsidy when they're not a government entity? And so I do think we've seen some great examples of partnerships between Lyft and Uber in distal areas in Los Angeles, in Cincinnati, in Boston. Great examples of paratransit service being provided by fleet-based rideshare. And so I do think those provide some lessons in terms of how we can partner, but I don't think we should throw off all the responsibility providing services, particularly given, you know, the federal government allows us to actually subsidize our transit to actually provide that. And so I don't think we should give all the responsibility to these companies. I think I think that the tension is that I think there is a real desire to innovate the vehicle. And I think what we should really be asking ourselves, particularly for the people that have been underserved and particularly from I would say a latent demand standpoint, so older adults, young people that have been underserved just generationally, we should ask, like, how are these vehicles being purpose-built and purposely designed for them to give them more mobility? And the tension there is because there's going to be a lot of dialogue about induced demand. And I think we have to acknowledge that an increase in VMT, particularly if you're serving people that have traditionally been marginalized and underserved, and that increase in VMT isn't always a bad thing. And so there's also this conversation we have to have about fuel types, about vehicle occupancy, about type of platform, how many people are in that platform. And of course, COVID with shared vehicles presented other wrinkles. So I guess I say all this super wicked problem, but it's actually an opportunity to really talk about solutions to some of these, but it is going to be public and private partnerships are going to be somehow how we're going to do this.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing I'd add is that there's some really thoughtful research that's going on in the rural environment right now. USDOT a couple of years ago in 2019, they didn't quite make it to $100 million, but I think they made it pretty close, and they designated, I think, up to 10 various grants, and several of them are looking in the rural context. But I think there's going to be a mandate to kind of continue to increasingly think of equity, not just from equality, but real equity, like the distinctions between entities. That's going to be pushed. But I take your point well, Bill, that this isn't something that's singular for the companies to solve. It really is going to take a public-private partnership to think creatively about long-standing issues that maybe potentially could be exacerbated by AVs as opposed to addressed, as we hope.
So one thing I think about a lot is we run these 60 to 120 foot platforms in some lines that are critical lines that serve historically marginalized populations, but we're running a really large platform for 8 to 10 people. And even if we started innovating the platform, I think that's a move in the right direction. So when I say the platform, just like looking at more lightweight vehicles that are more like like what we used to call PRT, personal rapid transit, or are more like a dial-a-ride service?
That's great. Okay, so I'll move on to the next question. I think it's tangential, so bear with me. So I'm wondering about the role of government, and I'm thinking state and federal level right now in AV technology, and what should it be? And then to kind of tack on that with a little commentary here, motor vehicles are so highly regulated in general, but right now it seems that AV technology is a little bit more free market driven. I could be wrong about that. So I'd love to hear any thoughts on government's role.
Well, as one government person, I mean, I think to Billy's point, you know, the foundational assumption to all this is there will be a lot of partnering going on, whether it's private and public sectors and different sectors, as well as jurisdictions at each level of government. And we all, I think, are hoping the federal government, as the top regulator of the country, would come forward with some standardized rules of operation and kind of the foundational pieces of regulation that states then work from, like we do in many other areas of lawmaking. And I think the problem right now that states are struggling with is we don't have that. And so you've got a lot of testing happening in certain states, a lot of states at different paces trying to decide how much do we need to worry about this right now? If we want to do something, what do we do? We don't want to legislate too early and suppress the innovation. You know, what are we really legislating for? We don't know what they are. They're not here. I mean, there's all these, it's like we're spinning our wheels and not going anywhere, ironically, with something so innovative. So it'd be nice to have, you know, that federal leadership kind of come out and set the foundation for us all to launch from. So we have a starting point, and it's consistently applied across the country. So from a manufacturer or an operator standpoint, they're dealing with the same set of core regulations from state to state, not, well, this state X is, you know, has no laws and the other state has a lot of laws. And you kind of get this variation that also changes how the service will advance. So that federal foundation is critical, I think, for the industry to advance in a way that's going to be beneficial for the public. But also from the governmental perspective, we do worry about how it advances, how testing advances. How do we make sure we're not turning the public into, you know, testing dummies, for lack of a better word, in the process of evolution. We know they're going to be better than human drivers because we're not very good at driving. So that's a good thing. But, you know, at the same time, how do we get there without putting at risk people's safety in the meantime or through that transition? So I think, you know, the regulatory structure for that transitionary time is also needed. It's not just here's the foundation when we have AVs. It's really, we need guidance on how are we going to manage in that transitionary process, because people aren't going to overnight not own cars. So, you know, this notion of intermixing a fleet of AVs and high-tech cars and cars from 1970, you know, how are they going to play together on the highway? And how do you ensure those that are still driving humans or driving cars, how are they going to interact with these AVs and as pedestrians and bike riders? So there's, you know, how are we going to interact to make sure that that car sees me? Because I don't have eye contact now with a driver, right? So there's a lot of questions around why regulation, lawmaking structures are critical to ensure an orderly transition that doesn't maybe put at risk public safety, but also help support innovation in a way that will actually help propel the industry, I think, even faster when we've got kind of a national plan, you know, in place of how we're going to advance it.
Like, we should just give Rima a hug. Like, she needs a group hug. Marissa probably needs a hug too. I don't see federal regulation coming anytime soon. Only because we have a precedent in how a regulatory landscape was established through ride sharing. And just in my time on meeting with certain legislators who I will not mention on this call, There's not really an interest in taking this on just yet. But I do think there are some good, there's some good examples out there, and there's some learning happening in between states. And I know that a lot of folks, maybe even some folks in this call, for example, will be down at Arts 2022 next week. And so there are these forums, particularly TRB is doing a lot to try to advance, let's not call it policy, but guidance. And NHTSA's put out some stuff. So, and I think that while it may come off as fragmented, maybe that's okay. Maybe an ambiguous process is okay. But you do deserve a hug, because I can't imagine what it's like to be in your role right now.
Thanks for the sympathy.
I think it's hard to do good policy without the data. And I think that's been the big vacuum that's been holding this up. And probably to Billy's point too, we've got a political system that has its own philosophy about how to move that forward, and a real concern about not stifling the innovation, as we say, and trying to have this balance, because safety has to be at paramount. But I think we just have not been really, frankly, the ADS developers have been required to provide what feel like, frankly, from any perspective, marketing data on what's happening with their vehicles, right? I mean, there's no consistency between their reports. They don't really get into details. And we saw late last year, I believe, that the US DOT put out a requirement that they're now collecting data. It's not perfect data, but they're starting to collect data, and there's going to be more cadence with that data. I guess they just released the last year of accidents, which helps us ask some questions. And they're going to be putting out data every month, which I think good researchers, good policymakers are going to start to take note about this. I think one of the challenges that we have to think about is that it's okay in this kind of early stage to kind of not get too far ahead of the innovation, and try to, as long as, because think about what's happening in the state and the federal government. The federal government has a responsibility over the vehicle itself. And many of these vehicles are working, their systems are being overlaid on a Chrysler or Pacifica, which, from the federal perspective, that vehicle's totally appropriate to be on the road. And the states usually regulate the driver, right? They give us driver's license, they make us take a test. And so we're in this weird phase about how you define the driver in these new systems. But I do think what we're going to find from a competitiveness, obviously making safety is number one, but from a competitiveness and a technology point, we do not want an environment where every state has a patchwork of regulatory environment. Frankly, I don't want to get in a car if I know the other car has a better seatbelt. I don't want competition on those kinds of things. And I think as this industry and this technology starts to see some maturation, we'll start to see people in real earnest. And I know that I'm working with a group of researchers, both in the public and private sector, that are on various standards group. And this is a global effort to really start to define some data that would provide policymakers, not only in the US, but globally, with better insight into how to regulate these vehicles, what makes sense, and how to do it. So it's well worth staying in tune for and contributing to the conversation.
Great. So now that we're 40 minutes into a conversation about urban design and autonomous vehicles, we should probably talk about urban design. So my next question is, how could AV technology start to change the urban landscape, whether it's sudden, kind of a sweeping thing across the country in big cities or small cities or whatever, or even kind of incremental, sort of like that 5 stages type of urban design? And I'll tack in there also rural landscapes. I know, Dr. Riggs, you said that maybe it's not as feasible with rural AVs, but I'm curious how all that's wrapped into the changes that we'll see in the upcoming years.
Well, I think we should maybe just define, meaning saying rural can mean a lot of things. Like a rural urban center is different than a suburban strip mall. So I think it might be better to actually use like an actual urban design, like urban design typology in terms of how we're talking about this, John. Like, so we can say like, urban center, suburban center, and then maybe like rural small town. If we were looking at this, I think that'll be easier from a urban design standpoint, perhaps, to talk about, because I think otherwise we won't define what rural means, and rural can mean clearly, quasi edge city. It could be rural, but it actually might be a satellite community.
Yeah, thanks for I was trying to keep it
Well,
simple, but
yeah, well, I just think it's maybe good for some of us to get on some of those typologies, and I guess I'll just like jump right in. I'll start. Is that like, I guess I personally I'm not a heaven, when 2015, when I first got roped into some of this with some of these companies, there was a lot of people that would go out and give talks about heaven hell scenarios. And I've never been someone that talked about like super binary scenarios, because usually the future is much less dramatic than we anticipate. So I guess the way I frame it is that, yeah, there may be some longitudinal, like 30-year changes in job housing locations. And in people willing to tolerate longer commutes if the friction or the pain of driving goes down. But I do think that's something that it's so longitudinal. It's hard to plan for. And me as a planner, urban designer, I've stopped believing in long range planning. I only read like tactical, like 3 to 5 years. And so I'm just kind of comical, but like, I just can't predict that far. I never would have predicted COVID, right? But part of the way I think about it is I don't believe that the built environment, when we think about good urban design, like planning for your walkable core, and planning for low impact development and proper water filtration, and prioritizing low carbon modes, whether or not it's walking, cycling, or transit. And I do think, like, when we think about transit, that might be some form of lightweight autonomous last mile transit. Like, we should probably be open to that in the future, but planning our streets and designing them accordingly so they are at a human scale. I think that is the future. I don't know that our job totally changes as urban designers that much. And you referenced my book. I talk a lot about this in my book, about like streets should still be for humanity and support the human function. And because that's the mistake we made 80 years ago when people came back, GIs came back from the war, and we decided we didn't like our downtowns anymore. And there's probably more than 80 years, right? Anyway, I'll hand it off to somebody else.
I think autonomous vehicles are likely to impact like the metropolitan footprints and street design and corridor and center development, and also the urban formings, like the density, that type of things as well. And we talk a lot about like autonomous vehicle might also reduce the need of parking. So since the passengers can drop off or pick up at their destination without like park. So those kind of space that freed up can use other like purposes, like maybe housing, maybe more space for walking, biking, rolling. So I think, and also another thing is the curb design. So which is like right now we talk a lot as well, because if we don't need parking, then the curb management is another things that we need to like think about. So I think like those kind of things are really things that like we should think about how autonomous vehicle might impacting the urban design aspects as well.
I would throw in that I'm not entirely sure the overall impacts to, I'll just call it town center design, whether it's urban or rural. It's going to change a lot from the disruption we've seen with COVID and the impacts that telework has had, and on-demand service as well as parcel delivery. So people kind of becoming less reliant on driving to the mall or the store and having everything brought to them. But personally driving less because I'm working from home all the time now, so I'm not commuting. I mean, that shift to telework, I think, is going to be probably more disruptive than autonomous vehicles from the thinking around how we plan for transportation in cities and towns. And I think that is that when we solve those challenges, I feel like the autonomous vehicle layering in is not going to be that disruptive, because we're already going to have contemplated what about curb access? What do we do with that? And are we really going to, I remember some scenarios we ran a few years ago where we were assuming, we took a big tall tower in a big city and imagine, how many people pour out of there at 5 p.m., how many people show up at the start of the day at 8, and then, kind of flip that into imagine if, all these autonomous vehicles showed up and started lining up on the curb line to pick people up. And I'm thinking, how is it any different than Uber and Lyft today, right? In a lot of cases in these urban settings. But it's also, I think, changed how we think, because now we're like questioning the assumption of people are going to be in those big buildings, and how much of the population really will be going to job centers on a regular basis, right? Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. It's like, that's been thrown up in the air. And I think we're going to really see a shift in our culture that's going to really help us rethink how we think about long-term planning and what we're planning to. To Billy's point, long-term planning is a bit of a crystal ball gazing exercise. And when pandemics and things like that happen, it blows everything up, and then you wait for all the pieces to fall on the ground, and then you pick them up and you go, now what do we do? We still have to have a vision of something, but it is very esoteric at that point. And kind of, we're really kind of throwing darts a bit, but it does help us back into then what do we need to be planning for today, the next 3 to 5 years, and the next 10 to 15 years, as we think about shifting cities, moving away from parking garages. How do we reimagine the use of parking garages is another big one. So I think there's a number of things that are going to disrupt and cause us to be more prepared for AVs than we think, because there's going to be other things causing that ahead of time.
Yeah, I guess a little off from center relative to the traditional conversation we're having around, I should call it traditional, but the discussion around, how we're going to design our streets and what that environment is going to look like in order to either accommodate. And, there's just so many interesting things that are going on. We've got our colleagues up in Michigan that are doing a very interesting feasibility study to think about dedicated lanes and, maybe creating these specialized corridors. In Arizona, we've kind of taken perspective that there's just never going to be enough money to have that kind of dedicated space. We're going to always have to be relatively prudent relative to our infrastructure. But one of the things that I think that we're doing that actually is quite interesting, and I think over the long term is going to really give us insight, is that how do we leverage the infrastructure that we have right now to try to make drivers already safer, and AVs and their introduction in a more ubiquitous manner safer over the long term. And many, whether you're a state DOT or you're a regional local DOT, you've got a whole network of cameras that are out there that are utilized for traffic incident management. And so we're trying to mobilize those cameras, apply some of the same technologies that automated vehicles are exploring in their systems, whether it's AI or computer vision, machine learning, different things like that, that would help to make those cameras less Flintstone-y. Many of these cameras are very dated. They pan a little bit, they go here, they're very reactionary. So how do we turn our transportation operations centers into much more dynamically engaged systems for data and the huge amounts of data? And then what you could start to see is that this also helps to maybe create a living test bed, so to speak, in which we can engage with the ADS developers as their systems are operating increasingly in an expanded operational domain than they were originally set up for. as they start to interact increasingly with not only human drivers, because I think Rima's right. I had a car for 20 years. My mechanic said he wouldn't work on it, and I ended up having to get rid of it. But there's always going to be people that continue to hold on to their cars, but we're also going to start to see the Waymos and the Cruises start to see their systems interacting with each other. Right now, those domains are pretty localized in their spaces. And so watching how those vehicles interact with each other and with the human driven vehicles is going to be quite instructive. And I suspect we'll start to learn a lot about what could contribute, whether it's particularly on those left-hand turns, whether it's a system or a human driver, seems to be quite a challenge. And so there might come some interesting design elements that when we think about what that future is going to look like going forward.
Now, I have written down more than a few spin-off questions. Just this conversation's been really great. But in the interest of time and including our audience, I'm going to ask Marika's question that's in the chat. How do you see AVs integrating with the climate change and sustainability movement? Would this encourage more vehicle ridership when cities are trying to move away from cars? And how will all the car waste created from this switch be handled? I think that's a really good question.
Well, I guess I'll just do actually the shortest response. I am actually quite concerned, and I'm increasingly concerned because there's such an interesting development around the entertainment within the vehicle, almost, distract the individual so that they don't mind how long that they're sitting on a highway or they're sitting on a roadway trying to get to their location. And particularly, I'm currently on the East Coast, but when I'm normally in Phoenix on that side of the Mississippi, you get on the roadways, everybody is a single occupancy driver. And I'm just concerned that unless we can start to really have a conversation about sharing, you could literally see our roadways just become increasingly congested. And that obviously is not going to be necessarily a good thing. Now, I'm heartened by Cruise and others who are using electric formats, but there's issues associated with those batteries as well that we're going to have to start to confront from an environmental perspective. So I just really think we need smart people, those on the phone call today, and the young professionals to start who really are passionate about climate change to really start to get engaged in these conversations.
I'll take the last part of the question, I guess. So most of the vehicle can be recycled. There's actually a lot of, and particularly there's a lot of the heavy metals that are in electric vehicles can be recycled. So I'm not as concerned about kind of the materials aspect. But I do think that Marissa hit the nail on the head in terms of kind of figuring out ways to incentivize vehicle sharing. I think the companies are going to try to do fleet just because the economics of fleet work better for most companies, except for Tesla. But I think the challenge there is that we have to figure out how we do good roadway pricing. Maybe we figure out ways where you bid for freeway access. I mean, I was talking with some radical folks at Transportation for London on this, but I think that we have to figure out new ways of doing congestion-based pricing and roadway pricing.
Yeah, I think regulation is really important because like many studies indicating if autonomous vehicle used as like a private vehicle, it will increase the BMT and definitely not like benefit from reducing the greenhouse gas emission. So that's why we advocate a lot about the priority indication for autonomous vehicle will be like autonomous transit, fleet-based autonomous vehicle, and freight, using on the freight or parent transit, that type of usage.
All right, so we are up, unless Rima, you have the last word. Okay, we are coming up against the hour. So we're coming up against the hour. I know at least one of our panelists has to take off here. I just want to say thank you to all of you, and I'll invite you to stay after I stop recording. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who showed up, all two of you who are left. Thank you for taking the time tonight to be with us tonight, and the recording will be up online as well and we'll do some marketing with that as well. But yeah, thank you so much to our panelists for being with us this evening, and I think this was a really great conversation. So
Thanks, John, Eddie. That was great. And to all the other panelists, great to be on it with you.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
great. Thank you, guys.
Have a great day and weekend.